as we were studying the book one, and we have gone through quite a lot from the early days of the Buddha to, I would say, we have covered the philosophical background at the time of the Buddha. Then we have seen the Vedic, Brahmanic, and Upanishadic philosophies, and also we have looked at the Sankhya philosophy. And today we are going to look at what is called the 6 views that were prevalent at the time of the Buddha. And those 6 views are very important because they come often in the Pali text, particularly in the Samanya Phala Sutta, the fruits of leaving the home and becoming homeless. That is a Samanya Phala Sutta. So today, what we are going to look at is the 6 philosophies, and I would like to thank Harsh in the beginning that he has beautifully laid down this non-Brahminical philosophical systems existing at that time. So let's begin with that, and I think today we will spare some more time so that we can also look at the next section. So this 6
Namo
I thought you already did it, but no problem. We skip this time. So what is important here today is to understand that these all views that we are going to study are already prevalent in the society. It's not that they are the views of the past, and we come across these views all the time. When we are in the public, we see all these views even today. So basically, this philosopher whose name was Purana Kashyap, as we can call today, his name was Purana Kashyap, and in Pali it's Purana Kassapa, and his doctrine was known as Akriyavad. Now, Akriyavad means not affected. The so-called soul is not affected whether you do good or whether you do bad. So that was the tenet of this philosophical system called Akriyavad. And if you look at it, even if you kill somebody, even if you do something good to the world, nothing is going to happen. And because nothing is going to happen, you're free to do anything you like. So that philosophy also we see today that there is a view prevalent in the society among a few people that whatever you do, it doesn't have consequence because nothing survives after death, neither body nor soul. So what is the point of distinguishing the world into good or bad? Just do whatever you like. So that particular philosophical system is called Akriyavad, and its proponent was Purana Kassapa. So, I'm just going to go through these 6 slides, then we will come back to the scheme of Brother Harsh that he has very beautifully laid down here. Let's look at this all philosophical system in one sort of canvas so that we see, where do they stand. The another school, and this name is very interesting, Makkali Gosal. And the doctrine of Makkali Gosal was interesting doctrine. It was called determinism. Determinism means everything is fixed. You cannot do anything. The things are going to happen even if you do something or if you don't do anything. So this school is known today as a determinism, the school of determinism. It can be also called fatalism because you cannot do anything because everything is going to happen even if you intervene or you don't intervene. Even today, we see a lot of people talking about this sort of philosophy. They advocate this sort of a philosophy that everything is predetermined, everything is preordained, everything is going to bound to happen the way it should. There is nothing you can do about it. And I think this attitude of Makkali Gosal, which Baba Sahib Ambedkar has taken the word from the Samanya Phala Sutta, is Niyativad. So we know that there are people who believe in the Akriyavad. We know that there are people who believe in Niyativad even today. And then there is Ajita Kesa Kambala. Now, Ajita Kesa Kambala is a very interesting philosopher. He said that his philosophical system was called Uchchedavad, nihilism. There is nothing you can bear the fruits of your deeds. and there is neither heaven nor hell. Then man is made up of certain elements of unhappiness in the world. The soul cannot escape it, and unhappiness there was in the world, the soul cannot escape. The sorrow or happiness will come to an end automatically. The soul must undergo rebirth during 84 lakhs of cycles of Mahakalpas. So you see this school of Ajita Kesa Kambala. Even today, there are people who believe in the school of Ajita Kesa Kambala throughout the world, Uchchedwad. They believe that this is called nihilism. We can say that this is nihilism or annihilism. There is one school which says that there is the Niyativad, then another school says that there is nihilism. Now you bear these words in your mind because they are going to be of tremendous help to us when we go ahead in the book 1, at the end of the book 1. The fifth school, very interesting, Pakuda Kachayan, his philosophical school was known as Anyonyavada. Anyonyavada means things, this human beings are made up of 7 elements, Prithvi, Aap, Tej, Vayu, Sukh, Dukkha, and soul, and each is independent of the other, Anyonya. Okay, they are not together, they are Anyonya. And nothing can destroy them. If anyone chops off the head of a man, he does not kill him. All that happens is that the weapon has entered the 7 elements. So that was the Anyonyavad taught by Pakuda Kachayan. Very interesting. And then this is an interesting philosopher Sanjay Belatputta, and Sariputra was his disciple. Mahamoggalayan was his disciple, and his school was known as Vikshepvada. Now, actually, this school can be called the skeptic school. Now, who is a skeptic? You always question about, about whether this thing exists or not exists, like that. So they have a skeptic mind. It's a skeptic school. It's a school, a kind of a skepticism. And when you look at this doctrine of Sanjay Belatputta, we can see very clearly that the answer depends on the whims and fancy of the person who is answering. So it's a school of skepticism, a sort of a school of skepticism. The sixth school is very important for all of us to understand, because that even exists today. It's a Jain school, and what is called there, according to Mahavir, there was Chaturyam, 4 yams Dhamma, like Chaturvarna Dharma. There are like Chaturyam Dharma, according to which you have to observe 4 rules: not to kill, not to steal, not to tell a lie, and not to have a property, and to observe celibacy. Okay, in fact, 5 rules there. So one must therefore get over the bad, because your soul is going through rebirth because of the bad karma. So you have to get rid of the bad karma. How do you get rid of the bad karma? By practicing what is called the tapascharya. Enhance. Okay. So now we have these 6 schools laid down, and of course there were 62 schools prevalent at the time of the Buddha, but these were the 6 schools were very popular. So now you look at a system, you look at a situation of the Buddha where there are a lot of philosophical systems that are prevalent in the society, and they are advocating various views about the reality. And we can see that was sort of a situation which was very, I would say, interesting situation, in a sense that there was a lot of fervent going on, there were a lot of intellectual thinking going on, a lot of philosophizing was going on, and a lot of philosophers had different schools propounding different philosophies and doctrine. Okay, so you can understand that is not a dry intellectual atmosphere existing at the time of the Buddha. Now we have already seen how Buddha has rejected the Vedic Brahmanism. We have seen the Buddha's argument as to how Buddha was opposed to the Chaturvarna, the Varnashrama Dharma, and the concept of Brahma, the absence of knowledge in that philosophical system. So he has already done away with it. He has also done away with the Upanishadic school, that nobody has seen the Brahma. There is no ground to establish the Brahma. If you ask the question, the answer is don't know, niti. And then we have seen the Sankhya philosophy, under which the Buddha was trained. and Buddha was under the influence of Sankhya philosophy for a long time, and he indeed admired the Sankhya philosophy, as Baba Sahib Ambedkar has told us in the Buddha and his Dhamma. And then there are the 6 non-Brahminical philosophical schools that we have seen. So I think Brother Harsh has laid them down very well in these slides, 6, 7, 9 slides, and that is the way to go. So now let's look at the Buddha's objection to each school. Now, what was Buddha's objection to the Purna Kasyapa? What was the Buddha's objection? Buddha said that if Pakuda Kachayan was true, then one can do any evil or any harm. One may even go to the length of killing another without involving any social responsibility or social consequences. So Akriyavad is not helpful at all for the social responsibility and social consequences. Now you see how these different philosophical schools are being studied by the Buddha and so beautifully laid down by Baba Sahib Ambedkar. If you read the actual Samanya Phala Sutta, you can understand a lot. But I think if you read even this 1 page or 2 page of Buddha and his Dhamma, you get the entire idea of the philosophical school, because Baba Sahib Ambedkar has told them in a very succinct, very clear language. So, if you believe that Akriyavad, now we can say Akriyavad also in the modern terms as indifferentism. And Baba Sahib Ambedkar said that indifferentism is the worst kind of disease that is plaguing the society. Okay, so the point is to act, the point is to understand the consequences of the action, speech, and thoughts, and so on and so forth. In the school of Akriyavad, propounded by Pakuda Kachayan, there is no involvement in the society. There is no, not taking on the social responsibility or not understanding the social consequences of your act, speech, and thinking. The Buddha said that if the doctrine of Makkali Gosal is true, then man becomes the slave of destiny, because everything now in the hands of a fate, or everything is predetermined, so we cannot liberate ourselves. So the opportunity for liberation is gone. If the school of Ajit Kes Kambala is true, then all that man can do is to eat, drink, and make merry. Now, this particular school, Ajit Kes Kambala, he is the, I would say, grandfather of the school established by Charuvak. And Charuvak was the founder of a school called Lokayat, according to which you can eat, drink, and make merry. That school also was totally in opposition with the Brahminical philosophy. It is not that simple to explain Charuvak. The word Charuvak means sweet tongue. And a lot of philosophizing has gone into that. And a lot of people admire Lokayat or Charuvak's philosophy. And, the precursor of Charuvak's philosophy was, of course, the philosophy of Ajit Kesa Kambala, that eat, drink, and make merry. Sanjay Belatiputta was true, then man must float above and live without a positive philosophy of life. So if you're always skeptical about something, then what happens is you just float around. You do not have a positive philosophy of life. And if Buddhism is anything, it's a positive philosophy of life. It's not a negative philosophy of life. It doesn't negate the life. It's a very positive philosophy of life. So the arguments of the Sanjay Belatiputta are done with. And then Nighanta Nathaputta was the name of Mahavir. And the life of a human being has to be subjected to asceticism, tapascharya, a complete subjugation and uprooting of man's instincts and desires. So we can know, from this small discussion that Buddha was not completely for uprooting man's instincts and desires. He wanted human beings to cherish certain desires and cherish certain instincts. So now the 8th verse is very interesting. Thus, none of the paths of life suggested by philosophers appealed to the Buddha. He thought they were the thoughts of men who had become hopeless, helpless, and reckless. Choice of the words, very interesting. Hopeless, helpless, and reckless. Okay, so our philosophy is to be hopeful. We have to believe that we can help ourselves and help others. and we can be guarded. We cannot afford to be reckless. He therefore decided to seek light elsewhere. Look, beautiful language. He decided not to seek light in those philosophies. He decided to seek light elsewhere. And of course, we have seen in the beginning, in the previous chapters of this book 1, that Buddha indeed found a new light. So, there is a word, meditation for new light. The image of light is always there in the Buddha and his Dhamma. And, the Buddha is compared with the light that has arisen in the world to dispel the darkness. Now, and there is also, when Babasaheb Ambedkar draw this image of the Buddha, he wrote underneath that the light of the world and enlightenment. And also Buddhism has to do with a lot of light and, a lot of, dispelling darkness and bringing clarity, giving the touch of truth to everything that exists around us. So I think, these philosophical schools that we have seen, and we have also seen very clearly as to how Babasaheb Ambedkar has given very interesting sort of account of these philosophical schools: Vedas, Brahmanas, Upanishads, Sankhya philosophy, and then all the way up to the 6 philosophical schools, their clear exposition, and what was the Buddha's objections to all these philosophical schools. I think that's very interesting to understand the intellectual milieu, the intellectual context, the intellectual situation at the time of the Buddha. Then only we can appreciate the part 7 of the book 1. And I was thinking that we should finish the book 1 today, not because we are in a hurry, but it ties up with what we have been discussing so far. So the part 7 of the book 1, and I think this is a very interesting part, because you laid down all the philosophical schools on the table. And when you laid down all the philosophical schools on the table existing at the time of the Buddha, then you have to compare and contrast. This is how you generate the knowledge, by comparison and making the contrast. So we see that we can see through the way of comparison and contrast. As I told you, that a lot of thought has been put into writing the Buddha and his Dhamma, and we will see that every single line has potentially a meaning that needs to be thought over, understand, I would say elaborate, and also commented upon. So here in this part 7, there is a lot of you have to bring in a lot of your understanding of the previous chapters, your thinking, to understand what the Buddha rejected, what the Buddha modified, and what he accepted. So let's venture into that. And it will take us about 20-30 minutes to venture into that, and we will open up for the discussion afterwards. So what he rejected, okay, what the Buddha rejected, I think that has to be understood very clearly, that this survey of the philosophical and religious thought shows that at the time when the Buddha formulated his sasana, certain ideas had a firm grip on the mind of the people, and they were. So before the Buddha found his sasana, there were certain ideas which were prevalent in the society that time. The idea was that the Vedas are infallible. They are unquestionable. The second was belief in moksha, or salvation of the soul, that is ceasing to be born again. Understand the concept, ceasing to be born again. Okay. Third belief was that efficacy of the rites, ceremonies, and sacrifices as a means of obtaining moksha, that the moksha can be obtained through the rites and ceremonies. Then there was a fourth idea that was prevalent in the society, was belief in the Chaturvarna as the ideal for social organization. Babasaheb is not saying that it was completely established at that time. He was saying that some people were propounding the idea that Chaturvarna was the ideal for social organization. Then fifth, belief in Ishvara as the creator of, and in Brahmana as the principle underlying the universe. Sixth, belief in Atman, or the soul. Seven, belief in samsara, wandering together, transmigration of the soul. And eighth, belief in karma, the determination of man's position in present life by deeds done by him in his past life. These 8 beliefs which were existing there that time and had a grip over the minds of the people that time are to be understood very clearly. And Baba Saheb Ambedkar has gone into the discussion of that, explaining us the various philosophical schools existing at the time. So in formulating the principle of his sasana, now you look at the use of words, the word sasana, Buddha sasana, and the principles of his sasana. Formulating the principles of Buddha sasana dealt with this old stock of ideas in his own way. So what Buddha did, he did away with this old stock of ideas. So the following are the ideas which he rejected. These are the ideas which the Buddha rejected. The number one idea that the Buddha rejected, he condemned indulging in speculation as to where, whither, and what am I? Whence, whither, and what am I? So any speculation about yourself, speculative ideas about yourself, according to Baba Saheb Ambedkar, the Buddha rejected, he condemned indulging in speculation. So indulgence in speculation about I, the Buddha rejected, because everybody was formulating the concept of I that time. Buddha rejected. He discarded hearsays about the soul and refrained from identifying it with either the body, sensation, volition, and consciousness. So, he disregarded the idea of soul, and this Panchaskandha, one skandha is missing here. The Panchaskandha that the Buddha talked about, they are sufficient to explain everything about a human being. For that, to explain everything about human being, you don't need the concept of soul. Therefore, Buddha rejected the idea of soul. He discarded all nihilistic views which were promulgated by certain religious teachers. So Buddha was, of course, not nihilist. He rejected all the nihilistic ideas that, Uchchedvad. So Buddha rejected Uchchedvad totally, fully, completely. He condemned such views as were held by heretics. He disregarded the theory that cosmic progress had a known beginning. He said that, even today, people are grappling with the idea of the origin of the universe, and there are a lot of speculative theories in a lot of different religions, very different stories of Genesis everywhere. And they claim to have known the beginning of the universe. So, how now we know that the science has been venturing into this area. They are trying to ascertain the age of the universe, and also a lot of things are happening there. But the theory at that time that the cosmic progress had a known beginning. Buddha has his own idea about the beginning of the time. And he said that just like we cannot find the end and the beginning of a circle, it's very difficult to determine the end and the beginning of the universe. That's an idea in the millionth Prashna. So, somebody is claiming that, this is where the universe started, and you can talk a lot about how it started, and so on and so forth. These ideas are still in the realms of science. He repudiated the theory that a God created man, and that he came out of the body of some Brahma. So he rejected this idea that the world was created. And we will see that the Buddha, Baba Saheb Ambedkar, has put into the Buddha and his Dhamma that the world has evolved. It has not created by any being, by any Almighty God, and it came out of the body of some Brahma. There was a theory according to the Vedas that everything emerged from the body of the Brahma. The existence of the soul he either ignored or denied. So he didn't believe in the existence of the soul. He ignored it. If you talk to him about the concept of soul, he will either ignore it or he will deny it. So this is what the Buddha categorically rejected. Now, what did Buddha modify? This is a very interesting question. What did Buddha modify? Because we know that Buddha was under the grip of Sankhya philosophy. So he was studying Sankhya philosophy, and he was studying all different schools of thoughts around that time. So what he modified? Very interesting, huh? He accepted the grand law of cause and effect with all its corollaries. Now, when we think about the grand law of cause and effect, which in the traditional Buddhist term now we call Paticca Samutpad. So Paticca Samutpad is a grand law because everything is, because of the Paticca Samutpad, that's a grand law, but there are also corollaries. So what you see in the traditional Buddhist text regarding the end of suffering and the emergence of the suffering, there is a paticca samutpad, a cause and effect. That's very specific one. That's about the human beings as to how the tanha comes into existence. So that's a specific, it's a corollary of a grand law. So the grand law of cause and effect is there on all levels in the universe. You know, even the physical, whatever we term as the physical forms, they are also exist because of this grand law of cause and effect. So cause and effect as a grand law, great grand law. You see the word, use of the word great grand law of cause and effect with its corollaries. You know what is a corollary? There is a law, and then there are small aspects of the law, the corollaries, which you can derive from the main law. I find this use of word very interesting, and the way Baba Ambedkar has systematized, he has not said that there is one grand law of cause and effect. He said with its corollaries, because that can be applied to how the suffering emerges depending on the causes and conditions. You know, how the conflict arises in the world depending on the causes and conditions, how the universe arises depending on the causes and conditions, how everything arises depending on the causes and conditions. So I think that's very interesting sort of formulation that Baba Ambedkar did. He accepted the grand law of cause and effect with his corollaries. He repudiated the fatalistic view of life and other equally foolish view that a God predestined as to what should happen for man and the world. So he put that in an idea, there is one God who is trying to control everything, and he sort of he decides what is going to happen to the humanity and to the world itself. So Buddha thought that it's a foolish view that a God predestined as to what should happen for man and the world. Third, he discarded the theory that all deeds committed in some former birth have the potency to produce suffering, making present activity important. He denied the fatalistic view of karma. He replaced the view of karma by a much more scientific view of karma. He put new wine in old bottle. So that is the confusion. Most of the times we tend to accept the Brahminical ideas of karma, and without understanding that the Buddha didn't accept the Brahminical idea of karma. He didn't accept the fatalistic view of life, that everything is predetermined because you have done something negative in the past, you are going to bear the fruit of it. Buddha thought that you can do something about it. You can change the course of your karma. And I think that's very beautiful. That makes Buddhism a religion of hope. That, even if you are a hopeless being like Angulimal, who had killed a lot of people to get these fingers to make a garland for himself, to be able to offer to his guru. We know that even if you are the most hopeless person on the earth, even if we would have committed the worst crimes in the world, even then, the most important thing for you that you can do something about it. And I think this attitude of being able to do something about it is so important for us to understand that the Buddha denied the theory of karma altogether. The fourth point is the transmigration samsara was replaced by the doctrine of rebirth. Now see the soul, that one soul is passing from one body to another body, has been rejected by the Buddha. Instead of that, he replaced it with what is called the doctrine of rebirth. And we have been talking about a lot about karma and rebirth. So this section helps us to look at the Baba Sahib's view of the karma and rebirth. I find this fifth point that Buddha modified. He replaced the doctrine of moksha or salvation of the soul by the doctrine of nibbana. Very interesting. Even we in the Buddhist text, we find a reference to the word moksha, mokha all the time. And but we know that the Buddha has given different spins to the words. And therefore, we have to understand when Buddha talks about moksha, he's in fact talking about not the views prevalent at the time, because he has already rejected the idea of soul that would be free. So instead of that, he brought in the doctrine of nibbana, and we have to understand the doctrine of nibbana from that perspective. The Buddha Sasana is thus an original piece. The little in it which is old is either modified or restated. I find these sections very interesting and very important for us to understand, because there is a lot of confusion of the ideas, because we do not understand what the scheme of the Buddha and his Dhamma. As I told you that, in the book one itself, you can derive a lot of knowledge, a lot of interesting information about Buddha Dhamma, what is to be accepted, what is to be rejected, and so on and so forth. This third part of the third section of this part needs to be read. So I'm going to read and I'm going to gloss over every verse. Okay, so let's go. Let's begin. What he accepted, what the Buddha accepted. The first distinguishing feature of his teaching lay in the recognition of the mind as the center of everything. Mind as the center of everything. Before that, we see hardly any discussion of the mind in the existing philosophical schools of that time. To situate the mind where it belongs, the human mind, is very important. And we have seen that all these discussions that we have seen, they were either speculations about the nature of self, they were speculation about the nature of creation, they were speculative. But here is a very concrete beginning that the Buddha accepted and Buddha put forward. Was the first distinguishing feature of his teaching lay in the recognition of the mind as the center of everything. As a Buddhist, we have to firmly believe that there is a reality called mind. And I was reading one book where the one guru was telling to his Western disciple that it will be very difficult for him to liberate himself, because in the West, the people mostly believe in the reality of the material world. And it's for a Buddhist, the beginning of everything is that the mind is the center of everything. You can even underline this for a word, mind, this sentence, mind as the center of everything. Now look at this second verse. I'm going to read it. Mind precedes things, dominates them, creates them. If mind is comprehended, all things are comprehended. Beautifully laid out. Mind precedes everything. Whatever you experience in the world, you cannot do it without the means of your mind. So mind is the medium through which you know the world. Not only that, but you give meaning to whatever you experience in the world. You dominate with your perception whatever you experience in the world. You create them. So mind creates a lot of concepts, a lot of images. It gives them names. It gives them, identities. It gives them meaning. Okay, creates them. Very interesting. Mind creates the things. If mind is comprehended, if you can comprehend your mind, all things are comprehended. So this is the second postulate. This is what the Buddha accepted. The third, mind is the leader of all its faculties. All the faculties we are endowed with. The faculty of seeing, the faculty of hearing, the faculty of smelling, even the faculty of thinking. Whatever faculties we have, mind is the leader of its all faculties. Mind is the chief of all its faculties. Listen very carefully. This third sentence, as I told you, it's like, cascading effect. Baba Sahib starts with a basic idea, then he advances further, and then he attains the crescendo, the highest point of that idea. And this is the highest point. The very mind is made up of those faculties. The very mind is made up of those faculties of seeing, listening, smelling, tasting. So it's very profound. In order to even write a sentence like this, you need to have a very deep grasp over the Buddhist philosophy. I would say even the so-called Abhidhammic philosophy. So what is the first thing that you need to do is the culture of the mind. So the first thing that we need to attend to, that we must attend to, is to culture our mind. And we have seen that, in the scheme of Baba Sahib Ambedkar, the culture of mind, attending to the culture of mind, cultivation of mind is so important, so profound, and so basic to the philosophy of Baba Sahib Ambedkar, to the scheme of Baba Sahib Ambedkar. Second distinguishing feature of his teaching is that mind is the fount of all the good and evil that arises within and befalls us from without. So mind is the fount of all the good and evil in the world. It's the fount from which everything comes forth. The good and bad, everything comes forth from the mind. It's not just your individual mind, but the minds of others also, the mind of the world, the philosophical systems in the world, the thought process of the world, the religions which the people process. So you see, it's very deep. Now you can understand how Baba Ambedkar has simplified and put it in a very crystal clear way as to what the Buddha accepted. Whatsoever there is of evil connected with evil, belonging to evil, that issues from the mind. Whatever there is of good connected with good, belonging to good, all issues from mind. If one speaks or acts with a pounded mind, then affliction follows him, as the wheels of the cart follow the feet of the bullocks who pull the cart. The cleaning of the mind is therefore the essence of religion. Now see, what constitute the essence of religion? Very interesting idea. The essence of religion lies not in sacrifices, lies not in going to attend to God, not having to believe in the God, but the essence of religion lies in cleaning of the mind. So if we have to summarize, what is the essence of Buddhism, what was the philosophy of Buddhism? It was about how one can clean their mind. The third distinguishing feature of his teachings is the avoidance of all sinful acts. Sabba papasya karanam. There is a very beautiful Pali formula, and the formula is spread all over the world. In Japan, China, everywhere you go, you find this formula beautifully laid down, which is called Sabba papasya karanam, means avoidance of all sinful act. You cannot do little act here and excuse yourself. The Buddha says that you have to avoid all sinful acts. The fourth distinguishing feature of his teaching is that real religion lies not in the books of religion, but in the observance of the tenets of the religion. See, there are the religions which are the religions of the books, and everything written in those books are supposed to be incontrovertible fact, and we have to accept it as it is. Now, if we look at what Baba Ambedkar is saying through the Buddha's teaching, is this: that the real religion lies not in the books of religion, but in the what is called in the observance of the tenets of the religion. Can anyone say that the Buddha's religion was not his own creation? So see, these questions, why they matter? Because there are a lot of people who talk about Buddhism being the branch of these or branch of that and whatnot. And that Buddha was a Hindu, and Buddha was teaching Vedic philosophy, Buddha was teaching Upanishad, and so on and so forth. So many things and so much confusion that people bring in when they talk about Buddhism. This particular part of the Buddha and his Dhamma, the part 7, makes it clear, very clear. And that is the genius of Baba Sahib Ambedkar, that he has given us, like, I would say, essence of the Buddha's teachings in a way that speaks to us, that communicates with us, that communicates in the context that we live our lives. And it makes a lot of things simple for us. And it's not easy to do, because in order to do it, you need to put a lot of intellectual efforts, a lot of practical efforts. And on the top of that, you have to have the understanding, the real understanding of what it is. So what I would like to do today is to stop here and open up the floor for discussion, comments, whatever you would like to do. But for me, this part is very important for us to understand. This brings us to the end of the book 1. Now you can understand that if you read through book 1, how much knowledge, how much practical knowledge, how much Buddhist practices you can understand. We are now going to aim at these 7 books. So, that's a long way to go, but we have already finished the 1/8 of the book, and that's already we are, I would say, on the target of studying the Buddha and Dhamma together. So I will open the floor for discussions and your comments. Anybody would like to say anything?
Mangesh Bhai, I'm Banu here.
Yes.
One question is actually, as you are I just joined in the middle of the session, but the question is actually mind is everything. So what we think in the mind, the consequences will follow.
Yeah.
So what is the problem, like especially our network? Where is the gap? Why we still face problems? Even some people are having good thoughts in their mind, but still, as you mentioned in this session also, because of other people's bad thoughts, the good people also affecting, especially that is where how the reality of one network in India. Everywhere daily we see rape or murder case, anywhere atrocity, no justice anywhere. So what is the solution for it? Where we are failing that mind, even though some people are innocent people only suffering, especially in India, most of the innocent are targeted. So how we can correct that mind? What should be our approach? Can you share your thoughts on that?
Okay. I think this is a good question to understand the mind, the nature of mind, because it's not easy, as Baba Sahib Ambedkar said, that to comprehend mind is to comprehend everything. And comprehension of mind, what is mind is a big question. How do we understand the mind is a big question. There are, of course, ways to inquire, to understand your mind through, the contemplation, through the practices of samadhi. You can begin to see the different dimensions of your mind, and so on and so forth. The mind of the world is a concept that has been given by Baba Sahib Ambedkar in the I think the Buddha and Buddha and the Future of His Religion. I have to check it, where the Buddha says, the Baba Sahib Ambedkar says that the Buddha said that the greatest thing Buddha did was to tell the world that the world can be reformed only by the reformation of the mind of the man and the mind of the world. So we have to understand that mind is not an individual mind only. It is also a social mind. It's also a communal mind. A lot of people having the same ideas together. We can say that that's a social mind. Even the ideas are not individual. These ideas arise because of the social interaction. It's very difficult to break through the mold of the social ideas or social mind. And Baba Sahib's teacher, John Dewey, says that every individual is a concentrated society. So all of us in a way are the concentrated society. And to break through that social conditioning, that social mind is not easy. Even within us, there is a social mind that exists. For example, the language that we speak is already, biases, in a particular way. The community in which we are born in the class, so-called economic class we are born in, or whatever. But the greatest beauty is that whatever is the social mind and the cultural conditioning or a social conditioning, the Buddha has told us that we can break through it, that it is not predetermined. We can smash it. So now this is about us, but what about the others? And therefore I think the genius lies in the Buddha's propounding the Dhamma as social, in a sense that it's relate with other man, other human beings, the mind of other human being. So how do you transform the mind of other human being? That's a great sort of I would say an issue as to how we make other people to realize the truth. So of course, there are many various ways by which you can persuade other people to understand what is it. One of them is, of course, logic and discussion and so on and so forth. You can use your power of persuasion. The Buddha used his power of persuasion to transform other people, and we have plenty of examples of that. The second is, of course, you try to challenge those ideas, those causes. So for example, idea of caste, idea of gender inequality, you can of course challenge that. That is what the Buddha did all his life, challenging the ideas which were inhuman, which were not conducive to Bahujan Hitaya and Bahujan Sukhaya. And I think the third most important is how you can transform the world or other people is through love. And I think that is very high point of the Buddhism, where the Buddha talked about the compassion, that putting yourself in the position, in the shoes of others, and trying to establish the communication between the two human beings. We know that this social conditioning is so much in this country that people have this very strange idea of caste, and it has gone into embedded into the psychology of so-called Indians through their culture. There are a lot of ways by which you cannot but think in terms of the caste. So I think the point is to be, there are a lot of things that Baba Ambedkar has done, and we had to try. We had to really strive. We have to really struggle. We have to build a community. We have to build a solidarity, because caste is about breaking people into groups, breaking people into individualism, and we need a force. We need a philosophy, particularly the philosophy of the Buddha, to break those that gap that exists between human beings and build the bridges. So there's a long way to go. There's not a simple answer. Then there is a legal structure which is social in nature. We have to. Then there is a constitution which is binding on all. Which is also, we have to see it as a manifestation of Baba Sahib's Dhamma, understanding of the Dhamma, that the constitution is there, which has given such a profound, I think, a legal text for this country, which is living in the ancient world, which is living in the medieval world. 50, 60 years back, the women had no right at all. A lot of human beings had no right at all. The untouchability was not illegal, isn't it? Even if you practice the caste system, which was not illegal then, but now it's illegal. So we can see that, different manifestation of that Dhamma. I think we can explore as we go on.
Yeah, thank you, Mahesh.
Pankaj?
Mangesh sir, thank you so much for such a beautiful discussion. Just a question arises in my mind. This Buddha placed mind on the topmost thing, as a center of everything. Now, he was under influence of Sankhya philosophy also, wherein there was Anapanasati, Pranayam, and Samadhi was also there. So are we going to see these methods as taught by Buddha, in any method for cultivation of mind or concentrating mind? Is it put in the book before, or means just I want to know, are there any methods which Buddha taught?
The methods and the practices are going to come in the further discussion.
Okay.
And Baba Ambedkar was a methodological man. He always tried to find the methods. Because of that, you will see a lot of methods coming up. There are, of course, techniques that are advocated in the different schools of Buddhism. Particularly, this Anapanasati has been used as a tool to calm the mind, and which is called samatha. And then if your mind is calm, then putting that mind to inquiry. When your mind becomes supple, when your mind becomes alert and active, then you can inquire into nature of a lot of things, including your own mind, and so on and so forth. So of course there are these techniques, and Anapanasati is supposed to be a very important technique by which you can settle your mind, and then use that mind to launch inquiry into something. Other methods are also there, like there is a Buddhanusmriti, that you become mindful of the Buddha, and by virtue of that you calm your mind, isn't it? Then there are methods like chanting. You chant something all the time, and that way you try to calm your mind, and then apply that mind to inquire into something. There is, of course, what is called the mindfulness of the higher beings. For example, if you become mindful of Baba Sahib Ambedkar's life, I would say that if you become mindful of the life itself of Baba Sahib Ambedkar, that can have a very balming and calming effect on your mind, so on and so forth. I think this has to be, if you have some living example before you, and Baba Sahib Ambedkar is not somebody whom we have not seen, or a lot of people have seen him, or forefathers have seen him. His impact is still felt. His lifestyle is still felt. So I think we have this living example that we can be very mindful of, think all the time, about how he studied, how he lived, how he dedicated himself fully, without worrying about his worries, and so many things happening around him. His kids are dying, his wife died, and so people are abusing him. I think in the history of the world, we will hardly find a man that has gone through all these difficulties in the life, and yet he never ever wavered from his goal of helping his people. He even said that I would lay my life for the people. That is the only thing mattered to me. And I think that determination even if we can get something out of that, little bit out of it. So mindfulness of the great beings like Baba Saheb Ambedkar can help a lot to develop a lot of the qualities or a lot of the practices that we are going to look at in the Buddhism. I think we have to understand when we study Buddhism, actually we are studying the mind of Baba Saheb Ambedkar in one way, and we can see the same light that shine through him can shine through us, if we really understand the great beings like Baba Saheb Ambedkar. So there are, of course, a lot of techniques. If you want, if you're interested, Deepak is teaching one course on mindfulness, and there are other people who are also doing similar things. So you can go, you can. There are a lot of now things available on the internet, lots and lots and lots and lots.
Yeah. Great. Thank you.
Naresh.
JB Mangesh, bro. So I think, as you said, right, the mind is the main thing. And I was reading somewhere, I think it was on the BBC somewhere, even the Dalai Lama gave an interview, and he said the goal of the human being should be transformation of the mind. And that thing should be in the education. He said, now our goal should be educate people how to transform the mind.
Yeah.
You said, so you brought new term, culture of mind. Can you elaborate a little bit more what exactly that means?
Yes. See, if you let alone a mind without attempting to culture it, the mind is going to sink and is going to follow whatever is the conditioning around us. Okay. So we have to consciously commit ourselves to culture our mind, to cultivate our mind. Baba Saheb Ambedkar said, attend to the culture of mind. I think this word attend means that we have to take conscious efforts to cultivate our mind. It cannot happen just like that. So number one is, first postulate I would take it as, Buddhism is a religion of attending, doing. It is not a speculative philosophy. We have to do something about our mind. So what is the culture of mind? And what is not the culture of mind? So, we have to understand the cultures of mind. There are cultures, for example, the culture of caste. What is the culture of caste? It teaches you to look at other human beings, either lower than yourself or higher than yourself. You're never going to look at the other human beings the way you will look at yourself. Okay. So that is the culture of caste. Then there is a culture of fundamentalism, like you believe that every word written in a certain book is the truth, nothing but the truth. It cannot be challenged, it cannot be questioned. Then there are certain ideas which are held in our mind so hard that any challenge to them makes us, defend it with force or with anything, with even violence. So what kind of a culture of mind that Baba Saheb Ambedkar is talking about? He's talking about a very human culture of mind. And one place he says that it's very difficult to become a god. Why don't you try to become a human being? So, when you look at the mind, it's always dominated by instincts. It's always dominated by desires. It's dominated by the sensual pleasures. Nobody has escaped it. The point is to remove these forces which makes mind at the mercy of the conditions that we have no control over. So the culture of mind ultimately means the mind which is independent to find its way forward. Okay, so we say in the ancient time, there was a culture of mind that resulted into the rise of Ashokan Empire. There was a community which valued the practice of inquiry and Vikshi. There was a culture which valued the practice of equality. That was the region. Buddhism went all over the places. It went from Magad to all over India. It went to China. It went to Japan. It went to Afghanistan because of that culture of mind, that culture of equality. So we cannot underestimate the culture of equality, the culture of metta, the culture of compassion, isn't it? Because there is no compassion in the world. How much we are so insensitive. We are so akriyavadi. We are so indifferent to the world. Nothing happens to us. We feel that, okay, it is okay. Let it go on. So I think, the culture of mind is a very broad term. We have to think about it. The best example of the culture of mind in our living history is, of course, Baba Saheb Ambedkar, the way he has cultured his mind, the way he thought, the way he expressed, the way he lived in the world, the way he helped everybody. I have been reading a lot about him recently, and once he was traveling somewhere in Delhi, and he found some man lying on the road, and then he asked his assistant to go and check whether that man is drunk. And we went and checked, and that man was not drunk. He was simply fainted. So Baba Sahib was sitting in the back of the car. He shifted himself in the front of the car. That man was put in the back of the car and was taken to the hospital. There are a lot of examples of the culture of mind that we can see. He's eating mangoes in his veranda, and there is a gatekeeper. He invites him to eat mangoes with him, and the other person asks, "You are such a big man. How do you eat mangoes with them?" He says, official positions are very different. In the office, there might be some kind of protocol, but here, when I'm in my home, when I see other human beings, I cannot but treat other person as the way I would treat myself. I think this culture of mind is a big concept. I would encourage you, a lot of you, to think about it, how we can bring that culture of mind in our communities.
Thank you, Mangesh.
We started late, so maybe another 5 minutes. It doesn't have to be question. You can comment. You can just express what is going on in your mind.
Yeah. Once again, a very beautiful exposition. I was just thinking that we were talking about the views, and can you hear me? Yeah, Mangesh?
Yes. Go on.
Are you able to hear me? Okay.
Yes.
So I was saying that the different views that are, we were talking about the views in the past of the contemporaries of the Buddha. How some of those views are still present with us, especially, when we look at like the nihilist spectrum, yes, and also the sort of like theistic spectrum. On both sides, we see that there's a array of views still exist in the society, both here in Asian countries within Buddhist, as well as like gross views and subtle views. So I just wanted to hear what do you think, the contemporary scenarios of the views, and I'd like you to address both gross views as well as because we are Buddhists, but our views are expressed through our actions. Yeah.
Right.
Our action tells us more. What do we think? What are our attitudes?
Yeah.
So maybe say a few things about that.
I think we have to tackle with all the emerging views in the world. As there is a test of how one view is essential and how another view is harmful for the humanity, and that is what we have seen when Baba Sahib Ambedkar was challenging the view of Marxist philosophy. And he was that time he was talking about the most pressing challenge that was posed to Buddhism, and all the Buddhist countries were coming in the grip of the Marxist philosophy. So of course, as a Buddhist, we have to know whatever concerns the human world, the mind of the world, and of course we have to look at the individual mind. So of course we have to look at all these philosophies. There are a lot of views in literature. There are a lot of views like romanticism, modernism, pragmatism, whatnot, in the film of in the realm of social sciences. In the scheme of, if you look at the so-called theoretical physics, there are a lot of views about. There is one school of thought, Copenhagen school of thought. There is another, Einstein school of thought, and so on and so forth. Similarly, in the political arena, there are a lot of philosophies. There is Hindu nationalism. There is communism. There is fundamentalism, religious fundamentalism. Then there, in the economic sphere, there is liberalism. There is capitalism. There is social what is called state socialism, and so on and so forth. So there are a lot of views in all different human realm, and of course we have to understand and study those views because they matter ultimately. But it's very important that we also cultivate samadhi. And samadhi is not something, is not a view. It's actually a process. It's actually an attitude of mind. Samadhi is nothing that, it's you have a view. Even if you have a fixed view about Buddhism, it is ultimately going to be a problematic view. So what Buddha is asking us to cultivate an attitude of a vision that will not cling to any philosophy, or that will not take anything as sacred, in the sense that to hold on to something as rigid. So of course, there are, if you calculate at the time of the Buddha, there were 62 views, there were Brahminical views and so on. Today, there are many, many views all over the places. Everywhere, there are a lot of views. But there is a test that is given by the Buddha, and we have seen what Buddha has accepted. And then we are going to look at the cultivation of Samadhi as we move on. So as a Buddhist, how do we explore the world through that attitude of Samadhi, through that process of Samadhi? How we understand something is, I think, a very beautiful method that the Buddha has laid out and has been told to us by Babasaheb Ambedkar in practice. So I think the best example as to how you examine the view and compare and contrast with Buddhist view is the Buddha or Marx. And of course, you guys can come up with the views like comparison of, say, for example, the Ashokan India and the present India. What's wrong? We can compare that. So you have these tools available to us, to understand different views.
Yes, the person must have open mind and open thought, or having right view or Samadhi, so that he listens what the other person is saying. And of course, he should mind be free of this greed, hatred.
Right.
So that Anapanasati is also one method.
Just like that, Anapanasati, we have to put into practice. We have to use it, but we just celebrate that this is the only way. This is the way. Forget everything. Then, this is a Michya Ditti, isn't it? That my technique is superior than you. That my approach is, more plausible than you. If you look at this kind of views, then, it ultimately leads to suffering. You see what I'm getting at?
Yeah, shield should be followed first.
Yeah. So as a Buddhist, we don't hold on to anything strongly. We use it, we engage with that, and we commit ourselves to that, to understand it for some time, and then we develop our own wisdom out of it, and we use it to cultivate our mind.
Mangesh bhai, one more question.
Yes.
So I was in Vipassana here in US, and then I just asked the teacher to say, okay, where is the mind, kind of, and then he said it's everywhere. And what he meant is basically saying it's everywhere, saying the mind doesn't exist really, but moment there is basically what you say, the consciousness, okay, you seeing something, that's the time then kind of a mind arises or something he was saying. So he said basically it's everywhere.
So there is, like, whatever you experience in the world right now, you are listening to me or looking at your screen is all mediated by your mind, isn't it? If your mind is not there, you cannot have this experience. So whatever we experience as a world is always mediated by your mind. Okay, so it's very difficult to separate, the higher philosophies of the Buddhist philosophers. They say it's very difficult to separate the world from the mind, because they are also, interdependent. And so what is mind? There are a lot of models of mind that has been given by the Buddhist philosophers. And there is a model of mind given by Vasubandhu in terms of, 8 minds, 8 levels of mind. But as Babasaheb Ambedkar has said, that these 8 levels, that's why I said that whatever lines Babasaheb Ambedkar has put in here, they are so interesting. Like he said, the very mind is made up of those faculties. So even if you segregate or categorize various faculties of mind, ultimately that segregation itself is not tenable. It's just an educative device. Ultimately, all those faculties are are the very mind that we are talking about. Now, whatever I'm even talking to you is the expression of mind, is the mind itself,
That's true.
isn't it?
Yes, whatever we experience, our mind should be there.
Yes,
We are
it's mind
listening, our
only.
mind should be there
Yes,
in
it's
listening.
it's
should
mind only.
attend.
It's
Yeah.
mind only. When I'm
Mind
talking to
only.
you, my words are also mine only.
Yeah. But the main, that is mainspring is different and these branches is different.
See, what I believe the beauty lies in this Buddha's conception, putting mind in the center, and it is really at the center of everything. Then you get an immediate control over your situation. That you know that whatever you experience is because mediated by mind. If you flip your mind, if you turn your mind, if you bring the element of samadhi into your experiences, then that experience itself transforms, isn't it? So if you
Yes.
if you bring that higher, the element of samadhi to your current experience of what is going on, just for example, like one word, all that arises passes away, isn't it?
Mhm.
Or for example, the Marnanusmriti. Today I was reading something very interesting. It comes from Buddhism, and it's in Marathi book. It says that when we are born, that time only the breathing is there and there is no name. When a child is born, when an infant is born, there is only breathing, but no name. But when we die, there is no breathing, but only name.
Okay.
You see, so when I was born, I was not born with a name. So it was given.
Name. Mhm.
So I was just breathing. I was just a breathing being.
Mhm.
And then, my life, at the end of my life, my breath is gone. What will remain is only my name.
Mhm.
So that's what is life. And I think it's very profound the way, it has, I will read it to you in the next class maybe. And I have to find that exact sutra where Buddha has said this. Buddha has of course said that, after our death, what remains is our name only. Very interesting.
Mhm.
But name is also
And that
one of the skandhas. It's very profound. We cannot just, gloss over it superficially.
okay. So since a doctor is also here, so I was discussing with one of the monk here who was a professor in Sri Lanka. So right now I was believing in basically the forces of nature, kind of, right? Because from the childhood, say you are from Bandara, I'm from the village, and then the whole house broke basically in the storm. The walls basically like fell down, but nothing fell on me, or kind of. So got saved. So somehow this ones, and then another time I was in the wrong place, and I was just standing there, and I know there was a dog, and the other person basically had a gun, but he could not basically shoot at me. And then he told later, not to me, but other person, saying, yeah, I had a gun, I could have shoot him, but somehow didn't do it, kind of. So what is the thing behind all these things? Just the time, the situations, or there's some forces in the nature that basically protects you?
See, basically, there are a lot of laws in the universe. And like there is a law of gravity. There are a lot of laws in a sense. The Buddha has also given a lot of laws in terms of, talked about a lot of laws, like laws of nature, the laws of season, the laws of Dhamma, the laws of mind. The mind has also laws, and the laws of seeds, the laws of genetics, so on and so forth. So I think something happens, it doesn't happen due to one cause, and there are many causes and conditions. There can never be one cause. You cannot blame it on one cause or one condition. There are many conditions. For example, even when we come into being, it depends on a lot of conditions. That the planet has to be hospitable for the life to arise. It is itself a condition, isn't it?
That's right. Yeah, there has to be a suitable environment. So.
And then there are causes, like there are seeds, and that seed sprouts into it becomes a sprout, and the sprouts give rise to a stem. So, one cause leads to another, but, without the condition of sunlight, without the condition of soil, without the condition of water, a plant cannot come into existence. So we cannot say that whatever is happening with us is because of one cause. Maybe today we feel it lucky, but the time will decide. We might be unlucky, isn't it? So I think, it's very complex area to talk about. There is a force of nature, or it has a consciousness which tries to protect some people and it tries to destroy some people. I think that's not as simple as that. That people talk about collective karma, that in tsunami people die, a lot of people, they say, okay, they might have collective karma because they died in the same bus accident, so on and so forth. I think, we cannot believe this, because, we know that there are a lot of conditions, causes and conditions. It's not predetermined. Okay. I think we have gone quite a long today, and I'm very sorry for the delay in the beginning because I was struggling with my camera here. I'm very sorry for that. And this brings us to the end of book 1, and next class we will be starting the book 2, and I'm sure that we will go all the way through the book, and we will finish all the books of the Buddha and his Dhamma, all the 8 books of the Buddha and his Dhamma. I think we have off to a very good start, and I congratulate you for bearing with these studies for 8 consecutive classes, and looking forward to knowing more, learning more about the Buddha and his Dhamma through this beautiful book of Baba Sahib Ambedkar. So should we end here, Nikhil?
Yeah, I think also thanks to you
Thanks.
for initiating this, educating us. I think you have
Thank you.
basically have so much knowledge about this. I don't know basically how we can basically document everything or dump your brain.
No.
So,
We are putting this all videos for the people, and the idea is that once we become ourselves skilled in studying Buddhism, studying Buddhism, teaching Buddhism, then I think we can take it everywhere. Like you can start your own classes. I think you should immediately start talking about the book 1 with the people. We don't wait for the people. Okay, you just like what we did in the VRG. We had one thing, and then people were inspired. They started. I think Samiksha started her class.
Yeah.
In Singapore, there is a friend of mine, Sanjay Samant, who his wife started Marathi reading classes, and so on and so forth. So what my idea is this, that once we set on with some basic background, we just communicate. We create interest of the people in the Buddha and his Dhamma, and a lot of things will happen when people have this independence of mind to explore, to understand. And when we find the people with similar thoughts, similar insights, we will naturally galvanize, come together. So I think this is a wonderful process. Let's take it forward.
मंगेश भैया,
Yes, Deepak bhai.
मैं बुधवार को 5 से 7 बजे के बीच में मैं बुद्ध धर्म और उनके धम्म का हिंदी में अभ्यास लेता हूँ.
Very good. Send a link in the group.
हाँ, मैं भेज देता हूँ.
Okay, brother.
I think the sharing knowledge, going everywhere, that's definitely is very good thing. And then I know I read your all the writings, and I was speaking in the American audience one time, and on the mindfulness, and I said, what do you gain through the meditation? And I just paused and I said nothing. And everybody was just looking at me and surprised. Then why are you doing meditation, kind of? And then I remember one of your writing saying, when Buddha said, okay, what did you gain? Nothing, because you lose a lot of things.
Yes.
The bad things. And then everybody thought, oh, we never thought about this. So sometimes words do matter. It just ignites a different thinking process. So it's very good having a group and discussing things collectively. So.
Exactly, brother. Exactly. So thank you, Naresh bhai, for joining so late from America, and thank you, everybody.
Thank you. No, this time it's easy. Basically, we rolled back the clock 1 hour, so it's early this time. So.
Very good. Yeah. So thank you so much. Jai Bhim, Namo Buddhaya.
Jai Bhim. Thank you.
Jai Bhim.
Thank you everyone. Jai Bhim to all.